Welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're joining us today, because we're about to unpack a massive 1,000-year historical drama. We're talking about a story filled with absolute power, devastating miscommunication, clash in cultures, and a deeply entrenched dispute that honestly fundamentally altered the course of human history. We're looking at the Great Schism of 1054. This is the exact moment when the foundation of a global faith cracked. Empires found themselves at ideological war, and cultural lines were drawn that literally still exist a millennium later.
Okay, let's dive into this. How in the world does a seemingly minor set of disagreements, things like the type of bread used in a ceremony, or a minor addition to a communal prayer, trigger a geopolitical crisis that splits a global faith right down the middle? It's a fascinating mystery, really, and the answer lies in understanding that earth-shattering divisions almost never happen overnight.
Part 1. One Universal Church, a united but diverse faith.
To understand how it all broke apart, we first have to look at the baseline status quo before the year 1054. Now, early unity in the Christian world didn't exactly mean everyone was a carbon copy of each other. Actually, quite the opposite. The Western Church, which was centered in Rome, primarily spoke, operated, and worshipped in Latin. Meanwhile, you had the Eastern Church, centered in the magnificent city of Constantinople, and they relied heavily on Greek. But for centuries, these two halves of the Christian world actually worked together seamlessly. They were part of one universal Catholic Church. They successfully navigated their cultural and linguistic differences and somehow managed to keep this massive, sprawling spiritual empire united.
Part 2. Cracks in the foundation. The butterfly effect of disagreement.
But, as we know, harmony rarely lasts forever without active effort. Massive historical rifts are almost never caused by a single, isolated event. Instead, it's more like a slow, quiet buildup of tension over generations. One major structural issue was the role of the Bishop of Rome, also known as the Pope. Over time, the Western Church had developed a really strong belief that the Pope held universal, absolute authority over the entire global church. The Eastern bishops? Well, they saw things quite differently. They definitely honor the Pope as the first among equals, a figure of great respect, but they fundamentally did not accept that he held supreme, dictatorial authority over every local church in the East. They preferred a much more collaborative approach, where decisions were made by councils of equals.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the division bled out of the high-level halls of power and right into everyday life. It wasn't just structural debates for the elites, it was also about everyday, deeply felt worship practices. Take the bread used for the Eucharist, for example. The Western Church normally used unleavened bread, flat bread, no yeast. The Eastern Church, however, used leavened bread, the kind that rises. While differences in a bakery recipe might seem incredibly trivial to us today, for the people living through this, these physical elements were profoundly sacred. These deeply rooted local practices added some serious compounding friction to an already strained relationship.
And then we get to the theology. Enter the word filioque. This is a Latin word meaning "and the Son." The Western Church decided to add this single solitary word to the section about the Holy Spirit in the Nicene Creed. Now remember, the Nicene Creed was the foundational, unifying statement of belief for all Christians across the known world. By inserting just these few Latin letters into the text, the West thought they were simply clarifying a theological point. But the theological weight placed on this tiny addition was immense, and the ripple effects? Absolutely staggering. The Eastern Church fiercely objected to this addition, and from their perspective, this wasn't just a debate about the theology of the word itself. It was a massive structural disagreement over who actually held the reins of power. Their argument was that absolutely no one, not even the Pope in Rome, had the unilateral authority to just sit down and rewrite a core foundational creed that had been previously debated and approved by a council of all the Church's historical leaders. To them, it was an unacceptable overstep.
Part 3. The Drama of 1054, a Fateful Encounter in Constantinople. So all of this simmering, multi-generational tension finally sets the stage for the climax of our historical narrative. The breaking point has officially arrived. In a last-ditch effort to settle these mounting disputes, Pope Leo IX sends a diplomatic delegation, led by Cardinal Humbert, straight to Constantinople to meet with the Eastern leader, Patriarch Michael Cerullius. The stakes could literally not be higher. But instead of finding a peaceful resolution, the talks fail completely. Neither side is willing to back down an inch. The cultural differences have become insurmountable, and the tensions officially boil over into open hostility.
But here is a truly shocking historical plot twist.
Unbeknownst to Cardinal Humbert and the rest of his delegation, who were fiercely arguing their case in Constantinople, Pope Leo IX had actually died 3 months prior back in Rome. Because information traveled agonizingly slowly in the 11th century, no one in the East knew. And because the Pope who sent him was dead, Cardinal Humbert's official authority to negotiate or to condemn anyone on behalf of the papacy had technically expired under canon law. What happens next is profoundly ironic, incredibly dramatic, and, well, legally highly questionable.
Despite his expired authority, Humbert makes a dramatic, irreversible move. On July 16, 1054, Humbert marched right into the Hagia Sophia and placed a document of excommunication on the altar. Just imagine the sheer weight of that moment. The Hagia Sophia was the absolute grandest, most awe-inspiring church in the Eastern world. And right in the middle of a sacred service, a foreign delegate aggressively marches up the aisle and slams down a document cutting the Eastern Patriarch off from the church entirely. This was a physical act of absolute defiance that would ripple through the next 1,000 years of history.
As you can imagine, the East did not take this lightly. The shock of the moment quickly turned to decisive action. In immediate retaliation, Patriarch Michael Cyriliaris convened his own Synod of Bishops and declared the entire papal delegation excommunicated right back. This swift, reciprocal act officially marked the mutual excommunication between the Eastern and Western factions, severing the spiritual ties between Rome and Constantinople.
So the crucial point is understanding the context of this showdown. These were highly personal excommunications aimed at specific individuals, Humbert and the Patriarch. It wasn't a blanket condemnation of the millions of people living across the East or the West. In fact, everyday Christians, peasant farmers, merchants, local priests, they didn't realize the immediate severity of what had just happened. News traveled slowly, and even when it did, many just assumed it was another high-level political squabble that would eventually be smoothed over. It wasn't an instant global split, but it lit a highly dangerous, slow-burning fuse that set a grim precedent of formal division.
Part 4. The Point of No Return. The Tragedy of 1204.
While the events of 1054 created a massive bureaucratic and theological fracture, the true point of no return required something far more tragic. To see how this theological dispute turned into devastating physical violence, we have to fast forward generations later to the year 1204. During the Fourth Crusade, an army of Western Christian crusaders was diverted from their original military mission. Through a really complex web of debt, politics, and opportunism, this massive Western army found themselves camped right outside the walls of the great Eastern Christian city of Constantinople. What followed was a devastating physical betrayal that shocked the medieval world. The Western Crusaders brutally sacked and looted Constantinople. They didn't just attack a rival city, they turned their weapons on fellow Christians. They destroyed ancient Eastern churches, stole sacred artifacts, stripped altars bare, and inflicted unimaginable violence upon the civilian population. The psychological and cultural shock of this event, it just cannot be overstated. It deeply scarred the psyche of the Eastern world and widened the cultural wounds far beyond any debate over unleavened bread or Latin words.
The tragic sacking of Constantinople was the true catalyst that pushed the disagreements of 1054 past any reasonable point of reconciliation. This visceral, physical betrayal essentially built an impenetrable, permanent wall of grief and distrust between the two regions. The theology had started the argument for sure, but the bloodshed cemented those theological divisions into a permanent historical rift. The universal church was truly broken.
Part 5. A 1,000-year divide. The modern legacy. Let's move to and see how this builds into our modern world.
Looking at the ultimate outcome of these cascading events, we can see exactly where things stand today. The Western Church of the pre-1054 era evolved into what we know today as the Roman Catholic Church, a massive global institution. The Eastern Church, holding tightly to its conciliar traditions, is known today as the Eastern Orthodox Church. But here's the amazing part. Despite an agonizing, violent split, there are two separate church bodies that still share fundamental early church roots. To this day, both preserve apostolic succession and celebrate the same core sacraments. They're remarkably similar in their historical foundations, yet remain separated by 1,000 years of history.
Ultimately, the path to division summarizes the core thesis of our explainer today. Massive societal divisions simply do not happen overnight. They grow through early cultural and theological tension, they hit a dramatic breaking point, like the mutual excommunications of 1054, and they're cemented by irreversible, often tragic actions, like the Sack of Constantinople in 1204. And they leave a legacy that requires active, ongoing dialogue and profound mutual respect centuries later to even begin the arduous process of healing.
Which leaves us with this final, vital thought to reflect upon. If a 1,000-year global schism wasn't born in a day, but rather from a slow buildup of small disputes over things like bread recipes, delayed communications, and quiet struggles over who is truly in charge, what modern divides are we slowly building in our own world today, entirely without realizing it? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating slice of history with me, and keep asking the big questions.